Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Uplifting Impact podcast. I'm Justin Ponder, Chief Information Officer with Uplifting Impact, and I'm excited to be hosting you today as we dive deeper into our journey to make the world more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Today, I'm very excited to be talking with Dr. Decoteau J. Irby. Decoteau Irby is an associate professor of educational policy studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research examines how equity-focused school leadership improves Black children and youth's academic achievement and socio-emotional well-being. He is the author of the book, Stuck Improving Racial Equity in School Leadership, and co-editor along with Charity Anderson and Charles Payne of the forthcoming book, Dignity-affirming Education, Cultivating the Sombodiness of Students and Educators. Dr. Irby's research is applied through his work with Derute Consulting Cooperative, where he supports leaders and teams to create conditions for anti-racist organizational learning and continuous improvement. Decoteau Irby, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. So a question that we ask everyone, all of our guests, how we like to start off is, what brings you joy?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good starting question. I appreciate having the opportunity to start there. What brings me joy is music. I love music. I love making music. I love listening to music. I listen to music when I'm in the shower, when I'm cleaning, driving. I just love listening to music. And I also like making music. I'm a guitarist and a songwriter. And I also enjoy, get joy from being with my family, my children, my wife, my family in South Carolina. And then I love to be outside. I really love just, nature, being in green spaces, grass, trees. I just really enjoy being out in nature. So I would say those are three things that bring me a tremendous amount of joy. And one of my kind of jokes is that if I can have a family, a guitar, and be out in the woods playing my guitar with my family, that's my happy place.
You're set.
Yeah.
So what is it about those three things that brings you joy? I mean, joy usually helps us remember who we are at the core and what we value most, helps us reset, recreate. So what is it about those things that help you do sometimes what can be the difficult work? I mean, I read that impressive bio. That sounds like oftentimes it can be a lot of work and often you meet a lot of resistance. So what about that, those locuses of joy help you with that more difficult work?
I think a lot of the three areas, I think, help me maintain a sense of humility. I'm always fascinated by what people can come up with and do musically. I mean, it's a language that's universal and kind of just, if I come up with something, sometimes I'm amazed at what I was able to come up with, a melody, or, you know what I'm saying? How did this happen? It's a
Where did this come from?
Where did it come from? And then I think family always keeps me humble, because to my family, I can do things that are important and great to the rest of the world, but they know me at the core and they're me. They care about me for not what I'm writing or what I'm accomplishing, but for who I am and that I'm just here. And then I think that nature is also something that, cultivates humility, because, I've stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon and I'm like, I'm really small. Or if you go to, you realize how small you are in the whole scheme of things.
Yep.
And if you're out in the ocean, or, you're on a boat and you look at how expansive the water is, you realize how small, or I realize how small I am and how small humans are in the scheme of things. If you look at the stars and really think about nature, we're a speck of dust in the context of this whole thing, yet we mean something to people. And, we have emotions, and so we exist, but so I think something about the joy is from the humility of knowing how infinite and big the world and the universe and the language of music and those sorts of things are, while also understanding that even in that vast expanse, I'm still important.
Yeah. And I'd like to maybe dig a little deeper in that, because humility is such an important thing, but it's one of the things in this walk that very few people talk about, because in order to face so much adversity, to face so much resistance and opposition, it becomes almost second nature to emphasize confidence and audacity. And even your own work talking about dignity-affirming education, it seems very obvious to people who are already convinced that they're small and they need to be convinced that they're bigger. So how do you get people, or how do you balance that need for dignity, which some might say is oh, you get bigger and bigger, also with that need for humility, which seems on the surface to be emphasizing smallness? How do you balance those things, being humble but also confident?
Right. Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't think that the two are kind of as I was kind of describing them, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think they kind of go hand in hand. But I think the important thing is that humility, especially in relation to nature, music, which is universal, right? A universal language. Like you can play music or tap your feet or dance with anybody, right? So it's and enjoy music with anybody. You don't have to have a shared language. It cuts across socioeconomic status. So in a way, some of these things that, I've mentioned, even, family, most people have the benefit, of family. And, my wish for the world would be that everybody has people who love them, whether that's, blood relatives or fictive kin or community and that sort of thing that they could call, family, put under that umbrella of family. And I think that kind of understanding that you are small but part of something big is kind of dignifying, and that you're still a small part of it, right?
Right.
And so I think that it helps people develop a regard for other people, right? There can be a kind of overconfidence, which is different than dignity, right? To treat people with dignity, and move through the world understanding that nature has a particular kind of dignity, not human dignity necessarily, but a particular kind of dignity, which means we should treat nature and treat the environment in a particular kind of way, because we're one and part of it. It needs us, we need it, right?
That harmony, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of how I think of it. And I think about music in a very similar way. It's multiple people can be a part of it, right? Like if I'm performing, the person's smile is a part of the musical experience, or nodding a head or tapping a foot. All of that is in sync. And to be a small part of that greater whole is a dignifying experience in how I think about the human experience, right? I think absent of all of those things, it will be very hard to understand what my humanity is about without thinking about myself in relationship to others, in relationship to the environment, and to the relationship of the human experience, which I think music captures in a very kind of universal way. And so all of that stuff, I think, is where humility gives you a sense of purpose and power. And so it's not necessarily so much about being big. It's about recognizing one's purpose and connectedness to other people and other things as kind of purposes, as well.
And picking up on the idea of connection, most people in this podcast come from specific diversity, equity, and inclusion backgrounds in HR, DEI officers, or part of DEI committees in companies, corporations, other organizations. And your approach is a little bit different. You focus on education. So how important is diversity, equity, inclusion to you and the work that you do in the education space? And what value does it bring to your work specifically?
Yeah, it's really important. I have thought that, what is now called diversity, equity, inclusion has always been important to me. I've thought about it more in terms of, and I think about it more in terms of equity as the center of what I'm primarily concerned with. And I could talk a little bit about that, but, it's always been important to everything I've been doing. I can remember I was in I tell people this and they're just like, you were an interesting kid. But when I was in high school, I was in a program called Youth in Government. And it was a program where high schoolers took over the state capitol for a week in South Carolina.
Wow.
And so, you learn how the legislative process worked at the state level. And I remember the bill that I introduced multiple years in a row was to reduce the sentencing for crack cocaine to be on par with powder cocaine. This was in 1994, 95. And this is where, I'm in high school and I'm like, and of course my bill failed miserably every time, right? But these are the things that I was thinking about even when I was like 14 and 15, because I would read and I would say, this doesn't make any sense. Like, crack cocaine comes from powder cocaine. Why are you being punished more severely for a very small amount of this drug substance versus, less? And then, of course, there's issues of it's race. It's about race and racism. And so I was always interested in like, how can this be made more equitable? Right. And so that's always been the kind of core of what I've been interested in, is to make the world, make how people are treated more equitable, which I think then lends itself to diversity, which is for me about recognition and recognizing who's already in the room.
But they can't be in the room until you have the equity that allows them to be in the room in the first place, right?
Absolutely. Right. I think it's about, and then I think the inclusion piece is that, because equity is about questions of justice and fairness at the core. And so if you focus in on issues of like what is equitable and trying to make things equitable, it gives people the self-determination to figure out whether inclusion is even what their priority is. Separation and sovereignty could be an outcome of someone, who has the power to say, I want to self-determine to be sovereign. I want to self-determine to have my own space, my own affinity spaces. And this goes back to the issue of equity. I mean, the issue of humility is it also helps me understand that other people should have a similar right to self-determine. And so once we have, because I think equity is really about access to power, influence, right? So that you can more fully participate in a society and deliberate about the ongoing question of justice and fairness. And if you can participate in that conversation about justice and fairness, then allows you to think about what you want to be a part of, what you want to be included in, as well as to make the determination of like, I don't have a desire to be included in this particular kind of environment, and why. And if you make that determination, then the question becomes, what are viable alternatives for us to pursue? So that's how I kind of think about it. I really think about equity as the center, and that justice, that inclusion and diversity can, be accomplished through an intense focus on equity of access, opportunity, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's really profound, because so often folks in the DEI space assume inclusion and belonging is the ultimate goal. And you're saying, no, we need to spend more time with the equity, because inclusion and belonging might not be the ultimate goal of the underrepresented groups. Like, no, autonomy and sovereignty is what I want more than to be included at your table. I want my own table.
Yeah. And I think part of it is just the opportunity to be able to have that conversation, as well as, and this is where the equity piece is important, the resources and power to create whatever that alternative might be.
And so digging deeper in this centering of equity, what are some of the primary ways that you look at that the educational system, maybe educational entities, schools, higher education, or organizations in general, what can they do to be more equitable? Like if I'm involved with a school, or maybe if I'm not involved with the education system at all, I'm just in a human organization, like in my company, what are things that you see that maybe specifically at schools that they can do to be more equitable, and maybe how that translates to, hey, I'm not in education at all, I'm in HR at my company. What are things that you see the best of hits for becoming more equitable?
Right. The big one that nobody likes to talk about, is straight up is providing not even adequate, but substantial resources to groups of people who have not had access to resources in the past. I'm an advocate for reparations. I think that could be in the form of land. It could be in the form of stocks, right? Like, if we're talking to people who are in HR, give people in big companies, give them give people of color stock options in the company as part of their benefits package. We really need to think about providing the material and financial resources. And I'm saying material and financial resources, especially for organizations, because there's symbolic resources, there's things about recognition and culture, like people can do that on their own. This is why it's important to have those spaces and those affinity spaces. But there's certain things that, we can cultivate in our children and say, we want you to be proud. We want to make sure your history is recognized, X, Y, Z. But an HR person in a company can say, we're going to give you stock in that company.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So
yeah,
that's something that could be done. So I'm really a big proponent of making sure that people have more than adequate resources. So if we're talking about higher education institutions, my approach is tuition is covered, housing is covered for companies. If they work there, one of the benefits could be, if you're a person of color, if you're an underrepresented person, if you work here for 5 years, your children get college savings plan. Will contribute to a college savings plan for your children. All of those different sorts of things that are very easy to do, but people want to focus on, again, the issues of diversity, recognition, making you feel good, like you want to be here. That's all good, but I feel like groups should do that already in their affinity spaces, whether it's a
show me receipts,
right? You know what I'm saying? Whether it's a religious institution, whether it's, parent groups, clubs, we do a lot of the cultural affirmation work already. The area where we're most locked out, where businesses, organizations, HR people can really make a difference, is providing, and I don't even want to, you could say in that language, it will be benefits, but it's really the material resources and financial resources that will repair the generations of harm, disinvestment that this country thrives on. And so a lot of it is like very simple things, college tuition, those sorts of things I think are very basic things that could be done. And those are things that consider issues of equity, which is about, again, fairness and justice. It's not fair. If we think about, I come into an organization or, a company, I'm working, my colleague who is white, who's next to me is working. We have the same salary, but we don't have the same wealth. We don't have the same, so if you're thinking about those sorts of things, then this person, their, $50,000 goes to their college savings.
Or it goes to
my $50,000 goes to paying off my loan.
Right. Because because my parents didn't have to pay a mortgage necessarily, because my grandfather got the GI Bill, whereas your grandfather did not get the GI Bill, even though they fought in the same war. So your family was always struggling to keep up with the mortgage, whereas grandpa bought his house through the government GI Bill loan for like 20 grand. We paid that off generations ago. So now all the money we've made has been to college tuition, whereas now generations of color are paying it for tuition.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's how I think about it. Those are very concrete things that it frustrates me that aren't a part of the conversation in the way that they should be. They are, but they're tangential. It's mostly people of color advocating these things. But they're easy to do.
Yeah.
It's very easy to do.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things that I think are really important. But again, they go to the question of what is fair and what is just. And unfortunately, most people would say that both of us making $50,000 is where the company or the organization's responsibility in terms of fairness ends. For me, that's not taking into consideration equity, a deeper kind of understanding of equity in terms of what companies can do if they don't think that the boundary of what they need to do to create fairness is just pay equity.
Yeah. So you've given us a lot to think about regarding equity, and like that's really broad, valuable, rigorous things for us to think about theoretically. So I'd like to, like, for like our last question, kind of zero down on your book and give you an opportunity to talk about Stuck Improving Racial Equity in School Leadership, and really like what led you to write this book and what are some of the key strategies to improve leadership in education, in addition to the things you've already enlightened us about.
Yeah. So Stuck Improving stems from a research partnership that I engaged in with a district that was struggling to, create the kind of educational environment and learning opportunities to support its Black and Brown students, who were an increasing percentage of their school's population and a relatively rapid increasing percentage. So this is a school community that at one point in time was, this kind of, suburban white community. And then they started to have Latinx, Black, other students and families moving into their community, largely to pursue economic opportunities, as well as to pursue opportunities in what was regarded as a, high quality school district. And the district and the people who were in it struggled to figure out how to support those students. So I joined the project when, ironically, they asked me to come in and do some consulting work. And this is a humility thing. Once I got a sense of what was going on, I was like, I don't honestly know how to help you all well enough that I would feel I could consult you and take your money. However, I could be a learning resource if you all would be willing to engage in a research partnership so we can kind of go through the process together and I can learn from what you all are trying. So that started back in 2013. And yeah, we worked together for about 5 years. And I was at the school on a regular basis, helping design professional development, professional learning opportunities, doing some coaching, working with leaders in the school, department chairs, working with teacher leaders, to really try to figure out, like, how can we make this school better serve its Black and Brown students? So that's where the book came from. And I wrote the book because as I was engaging in the process, I realized that although I was focused on learning from and with this one school, that when I would talk about what I was learning or what we're doing, it resonated. And the problems that the school was were facing resonated with districts, far beyond just this one school in this one district. And so I wrote the book to support, folks who are engaged in racial equity work but feel like they're stuck. And the basic argument that I make in the book is that there is a particular kind of capacity that the organization must have in order to actually even do the work. And so basically what I do is in each chapter, I identify a different organizational capacity. So one, for example, is Black and Brown influential presence. Another one, for example, is what I call curated white racial discomfort. And so this is a particular kind of discomfort that white people experience, and that they don't have the capacity to deal with a lot of issues that they will confront when trying to achieve racial equity, because they haven't had the experience of the discomfort, whereas people of color have been experiencing stuff that they were
all the time,
right? Even if you couldn't name what it was, you can get to, the age 30, and you're like, this is what was happening when I was in 9th grade.
Yep.
Wow. Right. So we have a well of experiential and racial knowledge that we can combine with what we learn when we read in books to have a different understanding. And we also have a different emotional capacity to deal with issues of race and conversations about race. And so what I argue in the book is that a lot of what school leaders and a lot of what the DI practitioners and consultants are asking, in particular, white communities to do, they actually don't have the capacity to do it. And so what I write about in the book is that if we start from the premise that many white organizations and white communities and white people don't have the capacity, then it requires that we think about a capacity building approach where we're thinking about like Black and brown influential presence as something that increases their capacity. And so now they see the value of like this person's experiential knowledge, racial knowledge is something that will help, increase my capacity. So having those people in the organization, having the ideas of Black and brown folks in the space actually increases the capacity of the organization. So it's really a very kind of different way of thinking about, equity, because it focuses on organization at an organizational level as opposed to what the individuals need to do. The book is about what capacities need to be in place in an organization so that it can succeed. And no different than if you wanted a school to take on, remote learning. We could see that when we moved into the pandemic, schools that had a relatively high capacity to use technology and the resources, the technological resources, they were at a very different place to be able to transition than school communities that didn't have those resources. And so just like we can think about technological resources, I'm asking us to think about what are the racial resources that must be present in the organization for it to actually do the work that we want it to do.
It's fascinating stuff. Well, I'm sorry, we're out of time now. I was going to keep talking about this forever. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Decoteau Irby, for being with us. How can our folks continue the conversation and remain in touch with you? If you've enlightened them the way that you have me, as I want to learn more, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, for sure. I'm on Twitter, which is where I'm the most active at Decoteau Irby, DecoteauIrby. You can also find me at DeruteConsulting.com and StuckImproving.com. And then I also have a Twitter, which is focused on Stuck Improving, and it's at Stuck Improving. I have a name that nobody else has. So if you just Google Decoteau, last name Irby, you will find me. I always have said that I can't do anything that I shouldn't do because I will be very easy to find. So if you want to make sure your child keeps their nose clean, give them a name that nobody else in the world has.
I saw Dakota today. He was running around doing X, Y, and Z. Can't say it was the other one.
Quite different than James and Muhammad,
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And we'll be sure to also put that information in our show notes. So one last time, thank you very much, Decoteau Irby, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And we're also glad for all of you that you tuned in this week for the episode of Uplifting Impact podcast. We need more people to help us uplift the impact. And in order to do so, be sure to share this episode, comment on it by going to our website at upliftingimpact.com, or provide your thoughts directly to us through LinkedIn at Uplifting Impact for Justin Ponder and Deanna Singh. Until next week, keep uplifting the impact.